Good evening, dear traveler of strange dreams. Tonight, we drift once more through the shadowed corridors of forgotten cures, through soft-lit apothecaries and damp graveyards where medicine was gathered in secret under moonlight with trembling hands. This is not a story of science. It is a lullaby of lunacy whispered through moss, bone, and old beliefs. You are invited to relax, to sink beneath the weight of centuries and superstition, and to listen quietly as we explore a world where healing did not come in pills or powders, but in the green fuzz that crept across a dead man's skull. They called it Usnea cranii humani, skull moss, grave moss, or, more poetically, Muscus ex cranio humano violenter mortui, moss from the skull of a man violently dead. Not just any dead man, of course. No, this moss had to grow upon the remains of an executed criminal. Someone whose death was not gentle nor quiet, but soaked in pain, fear, and somehow medicinal energy. It was thought that the violent death left behind a residue, a raw spiritual heat that nourished this moss, that the agony itself fertilized the cure. And so it grew tiny green threads clinging to old bone, sometimes a light fuzz, sometimes thick and vibrant, always collected carefully, quietly, often illegally. But first, let's set the stage. It's the early 1600s. Europe is steeped in folk medicine and Galenic doctrine. Doctors still talk of humors, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Illness is imbalance. The cure? A balance of opposites. Epilepsy, for instance, the falling sickness. It was mysterious, terrifying, a disease that struck without warning, twisting the body, foaming the lips, stealing the mind. People believed it was caused by demons. Others thought it came from bad air, or bad blood, or perhaps too much brain. Yes, too much brain. One common belief held that the brain, overwhelmed by evil vapors, would convulse the body. But what could tame such vapors? Enter the moss. It was cooling, drying, absorbent, and most importantly, mystical. Collected from skulls left to rot on the gallows, moss was scraped off with knives, tweezers, or fingernails. Apothecaries would buy it, grind it into powder, and sell it in tiny glass vials or wrapped in linen sachets. You could snort it, mix it into wine, or press it into wounds. Yes, it was also used to stop bleeding. Doctors believed that this grave moss had the power to congeal blood, calm seizures, and draw out poisons. Some even said it worked better if the skull belonged to a murderer. You see, the moss remembered. Collectors were unusual folk. In many places, hanging criminals meant displaying their corpses for months, even years. Wooden gibbets held the bones high, exposed to wind and rain. Over time, soft tissue vanished. But sometimes, if conditions were right, shaded, humid, and undisturbed, a velvet green began to creep along the dome of the skull. And that's when the herbalists came, climbing fences, breaking curfews, tiptoeing past dogs and watchmen, with small knives, sacks, and sometimes prayers whispered into the dark. They'd climb the gibbet, hands trembling, heart pounding. Carefully, they'd shave the moss from bone, scraping it into small pouches, eyes darting for movement. No one wanted to get caught stealing from a corpse. Not because it was illegal, which it was, but because the corpse might still be watching. Or worse, cursed. There were rituals, of course. Protective charms. Some collectors carried silver coins or bones from a toad's foot. Others swore they heard whispers as they worked. Not from the wind. Not quite. But from something deeper. Older. The moss was alive, they said. And when you took it, it took something back. At the apothecary, powdered skull moss sat next to dried viper flesh and ground mummy dust. A little bottle might cost a week's wage. But if your child had seizures, if your mother wouldn't stop bleeding, if the physician looked grim and said only try something strong, this was your hope. One physician wrote, "The moss of a skull, once the abode of crime and wretchedness, when powdered and drunk with wine, doth pacify the convulsions of the brain. For as sin feeds death, so may death, through nature's art, feed healing." Poetic, terrifying, and somehow logical to them. It was, after all, the age of sympathetic magic, the belief that, like cures like, death could undo death, rock could fight disease, a criminal's end could gift someone else a longer life. So tonight, as you lie back and breathe slow, imagine the world beneath your feet. a graveyard of old cures, a forest of bones, and deep within it, on a lone skull resting against wet. By the 17th century, the European apothecary had become a cabinet of curiosities, part herbalist, part chemist, part collector of the macabre. Shelves creaked under jars filled with dried vipers, charred hedgehogs, mummy powder, and yes, powdered moss from the skulls of the violently departed. But how did moss harvested from a rotting cranium in a gallows field make its way into a respectable bottle labeled with Latin and hope in the warm wood-paneled shop of a town physician? Simple supply and demand, and a criminal justice system that doubled as a pharmacy. Executions were public affairs, a spectacle, a warning, and, for a small but enterprising minority, a harvest. When a condemned man was hanged, decapitated, or broken on the wheel, his body was often left on display. In England, gibbets were erected, tall iron cages hung with the bodies of thieves and murderers. They creaked in the wind, swung in storms, and wept fluids onto the earth below. And slowly, if weather permitted, moss began to grow. Enter the moss men. These weren't doctors, nor priests, not even herbalists, really. They were middlemen, corpse foragers. No official title, no written contracts, just quiet arrangements with executioners, gravediggers, or the local authorities. You see, the executioner held a strange place in society. Feared, avoided, and yet needed. He swung the sword, pulled the rope, and sometimes sold souvenirs. A vial of blood, a shred of the hanging rope, a tooth, a sliver of skin, and if you waited a few weeks, moss. Some executioners let the moss grow deliberately. They avoided cleaning the skull. They kept it facing north where shade encouraged dampness. They even sprinkled the remains with water to speed the process. Because every pouch of moss meant coin, and coin meant meat, and drink, and maybe, just maybe, a sense that their grim task had purpose. Apothecaries rarely asked questions. If a sack of moss arrived in the night, wrapped in cloth and damp with graveyard dew, it was accepted with a nod. The preparation was simple. First, the moss was spread out on a linen cloth and dried in sunlight. Not too long, just enough to remove the rot smell. Then it was lightly toasted over coals to awaken its power and kill lingering spirits. Or microbes, whichever came first. Afterward, it was ground into powder with mortar and pestle, sieved through fine mesh, and stored in small glass vials. Finally, a label was added. Something noble in Latin, muscus cranii hominis violentis mortui, or simply mos ex homini judicato, moss from the judged man. Customers were varied. Some were noble families with epileptic children. Others were soldiers seeking protection from bleeding wounds. Some were desperate mothers. A few were just curious. The dosage depended on the affliction. For nosebleeds, a pinch snorted. For epilepsy, a spoonful mixed with wine, taken daily. For open wounds, applied directly like a poultice. For magical protection, sewn into a pouch and worn around the neck. Yes, even that. Some believed that carrying moss from a skull gave you power over death. A little death in your pocket like insurance. And if you were a particularly bold apothecary, you might advertise. Against the falling sickness and unseasonable bleeding, moss of noble skull, dried and pulverized. Guaranteed pure. Hangman only. Of course, not everyone approved. Church officials denounced the practice as profane. Grave robbing, they said, was a sin. Using the remains of the condemned for healing was an insult to God and the law. But the same church also believed in relics, bones of saints, vials of martyrs' blood, even fragments of the true cross, all used in healing and protection. So, where was the line? Some theologians argued that the moss held power because the soul had left the body violently, that the trauma of death opened a door, and from that door, healing seeped in. Others just shook their heads and muttered, superstition. But it didn't matter. When your son collapsed in a fit, foaming and shaking, and no priest or physician could help, you went to the apothecary. You bought the moss, and you prayed it worked. There are records, sparse but strange. In Prague, a ledger from 1672 notes, 5 drams of moss from skull sold to Lady V for her sister's falling spells. Payment in coin and figs. In Nuremberg, a herbalist writes, The moss, when taken with tincture of rosemary and honey, doth soothe the fits. It brings a calm as if the patient were pressed beneath earth, softly, deeply. And in London, a grave-robbing trial includes the line, found with sack of green fluff scraped from skull at Tyburn, claimed it was for medicine, not mischief. Medicine, not mischief. A fine line, often blurred. So tonight, as your thoughts slow and your breath deepens, imagine that old wooden apothecary with its shelves of strange jars, dust motes drifting in amber light, and somewhere, hidden in the back, a vial of green powder. No label, no instructions, just a whisper etched into the glass. Taken from the dead, to keep the living still. And as you rest, remember, what was once horror can become habit. What was once superstition can become medicine. And what grows on the bones of the lost may soothe the soul of the sleepless. One of the most common treatments involved mixing the powdered moss into wine. Not just any wine, it had to be red, full-bodied, and ideally aged next to a church. Why? No one knows. But it sounded holy. The instructions were simple. Take a pinch of powdered skull moss, no more than a pea. Stir it into half a cup of red wine. Stir counterclockwise. Warm gently over fire, but do not let it boil. While warming, speak aloud the name of the person it is meant to cure. Serve while the steam still rises. The patient must drink it in 3 sips, and then you wait. If the fit did not return within the hour, success was declared. If it did, well, perhaps the moss came from the wrong criminal. Drop of blood, the bleeding charm. For nosebleeds, which in the 17th century could be terrifying, a direct method was favored. Take a rolled paper funnel. Insert it into the bleeding nostril. Blow powdered moss through the funnel with a sharp puff. This produced 3 possible outcomes. The bleeding stopped. The patient sneezed violently. Then the bleeding stopped. The patient panicked, flailed, inhaled moss, and bled even more. Still, 2 out of 3 was considered decent odds. Some added a chant for good measure. Bone-born, blood-bound, grow from death to stop what pours. Let the grave give peace again. Whether it worked or simply terrified the body into compliance, the results were mixed. Lotion bottle poultice of the judged. For open wounds, skull moss was part of more complex mixtures. Here's one preserved in a 1691 notebook from Bavaria. 1 dram powdered skull moss, 2 teaspoons lamb fat, 1 pinch dried yarrow, 1 drop holy water. Optional. Fragment of the victim's last words, written on paper and burned to ash. This was blended into a gray-green paste and applied directly to wounds which bleed without ceasing, or which will not close. Was it antiseptic? Not likely. Did it infect the wound further? Almost certainly. Did patients report a calm, blessed heat? Yes, right before sepsis. But this wasn't just folk medicine. Some educated physicians promoted it. A 1675 medical tract from Amsterdam includes this passage. Moss from the cranium, taken in measure, is most useful to those afflicted with fits. If the moss is fresh and not tainted by sun or rat, its virtue is preserved. Best gathered under waning moon. Even Galenic doctors, who believed in balance of humors, found ways to justify it. Moss was cold and dry. Epilepsy was caused by internal heat and wetness. Thus, moss equals antidote. The logic was, by their standards, sound. Morally, less so, because soon the ethics began to rot. As demand rose, the supply of hanged criminals became insufficient. Not every town had a busy gallows. Not every skull grew moss, and some collectors grew impatient. There are whispers, not always recorded, but passed through stories, of grave robbers watering skulls in cellars to cultivate artificial moss, of moss scraped from any bone, then sold under false labels. of executioners bribed to help things along by dampening the corpses after death. Some even took skulls from plague pits, powdered the mold, and called it moss. Who would know? One London pamphlet complained, "I purchased from a dealer moss most foul, smelling of stable rot and dampened brick, not the purity of judgment. My daughter worsens, and I suspect I paid not for cure, but compost." Still others defended it. "Medicine is medicine," wrote one apothecary. "If moss cures the fit, what matter whence it came?" A chilling logic, but popular. There were even ceremonial harvests. In larger cities, some executions became not just public punishments, but medical rituals. Accounts describe this. A man is hanged. The crowd cheers. After an hour, the executioner climbs and scrapes the first moss into a silver bowl. A local physician blesses it. It is sold that day at 10 times the normal rate. One diarist from Florence wrote, "Today I witnessed the death of Giacomo the thief. At sunset, moss was taken from his head, still warm. It smelled of copper and damp linen. The apothecary sold it with honey. I bought a vial. It became a luxury, a grim boutique experience. Some towns tried to stop it. Laws were passed. No collecting of moss from the executed. Graveyards posted signs. Priests preached against the theft of the dead. But the moss kept disappearing. Night after night, skulls were found scraped clean. Perhaps not just for money, but for belief. Because when you've seen your child collapse in the street, when you've heard the doctor say, "We've tried everything," when a neighbor whispers of moss and miracles, you stop asking questions. You buy the powder, you pray, and you hope the dead are generous. So as you lie there, drifting slowly past reason and into dream, know that people once whispered to moss. They thanked it, feared it, saw in its green strands not rot, but redemption. And maybe, just maybe, that's all medicine ever was. A hope, wrapped in ritual, grown in grief. History is not just made of kings and wars. Sometimes it is made of trembling hands, glass vials, and the quiet hope that something scraped from a corpse might bring back a loved one from the edge. Tonight, let us open the yellowed pages of forgotten journals, letters, diaries, casebooks to find the stories of those who used skull moss. Not the sellers, not the harvesters, but the patients, the families, the desperate. Scroll The Tailor's Daughter, London, 1684. My daughter, Annabel, age 12, did fall into violent spasms twice a fortnight, wrote Master Godfrey T., a tailor near Shoreditch. He had tried everything: leeches, bleeding, cold compresses soaked in vinegar, and prayer. None helped. Then an apothecary offered something different. Powdered moss from the skull of a man hanged for murder. It was wrapped in silk and smelled of cellar rot, Godfrey noted. I was told to mix it with rose water and administer at dusk. Annabel drank the mixture. She gagged, wept, then slept. She did not seize that night, nor the next. But on the third night she woke screaming, not from illness, but from dreams of a man without eyes whose mouth was full of moss. Godfrey stopped the treatment, but the seizures never returned. Coincidence? Cure? Or something else entirely? Snake the Duelist's Wound, Paris, 1702. Etienne Marceau was a minor noble and frequent duelist. During a tavern quarrel, he was slashed across the chest, a deep, ragged wound that would not close. His physician prescribed rest, wine, and patience. Marceau demanded something faster. A street healer offered a poultice of skull moss and pigeon fat. Marceau applied it. The wound sealed within a week. But months later, he wrote, "When I wake, I smell the grave. My chest itches in the moonlight. My dreams are cold and green." He eventually demanded the wound be reopened. It was clean. No infection. Just moss-colored scarring. Brain the Philosopher's Regret, Leipzig, 1693. Johann Keller was a scholar obsessed with epilepsy. He did not suffer from it, but his brother did, and Keller sought a universal cure. In his writings, Keller describes obtaining moss from 6 different skulls. He cataloged their origin, cause of death, and moss temperament. He believed different criminals produced different qualities of moss. Liars were more effective than thieves, for example. He eventually prepared an elixir he called Tinctura Vitae Ultima, the last elixir of life. His brother took it. The seizures ceased for a month, but then returned worse, with hallucinations, night terrors, speech loss. Keller burned his notes. He never published again. Girl the Midwife's Use, Rural Wales, unknown year. A folk story passed through oral tradition. A midwife once carried skull moss sewn into her apron. She would rub it on the foreheads of newborns who did not cry, a symbol of life's first rebellion. One night, the child opened its eyes, smiled, and let out a laugh instead of a cry. No one had ever seen such a thing. 3 days later, the baby disappeared. All that remained was the apron and a fresh patch of moss where the child had lain. The tale ends. Use death for life, but life may take something back. The Collector's Curse, Vienna, 1711. Perhaps the strangest account. A man named Matthias H., a graveyard groundskeeper, had begun collecting moss in secret. He sold it at night to passing healers. But over time, his behavior changed. He stopped speaking, refused to sleep indoors, began covering his own skin in moss paste, claiming it would protect him from rotting like the others. Eventually, he was found dead under a tree, his face covered in fresh moss. The strange part? No moss had ever grown on that tree before. After his death, it flourished. Locals began calling it der Moobaum, the moss tree. Children were warned not to play near it. These stories blur the line between testimony and tale. They are part record, part caution, part dream. But they share something in common: desperation, belief, and the quiet idea that nature, even in its most grotesque forms, might still want to help us for a price. So as you breathe slowly, heart heavy with sleep, remember, each vial sold was not just medicine. It was a story, a life, a death, pressed into powder, sealed in glass. And even now, if you walk past a damp graveyard wall and see a soft green patch upon stone, ask yourself, who did it grow for, and who will it cure next? All medicines have their season. Once, moss from the skull of a hanged man was whispered in the same breath as healing. It passed from apothecary to mother, from graveyard to goblet, from death into life. But seasons shift. And so, like so many of history's stranger chapters, the age of cranium moss began to fade, slowly, stubbornly, and not without resistance. Test tube the age of chemistry. By the late 18th century, medicine was beginning to tidy itself. Microscopes whispered of invisible creatures. Theories of bad humors were replaced by talk of bacteria, inflammation, and circulation. A new kind of doctor emerged, part scientist, part showman, who no longer wrapped powders in Latin names and myth but instead pointed at beakers, charts, and clinical trials. Skull moss did not fare well under this light. It was hard to quantify, harder to justify, and impossible to patent. Some physicians still swore by it, old men with yellowed hands and ink-stained collars, but the young called them fools, relics clinging to rot. A medical journal from 1796 mocked it directly. To suggest that fungus scraped from the skull of a hanged man might cure the fit is to recommend mushrooms from a murderer's boot for the plague. Ouch! Scroll the quiet erasure. By 1830, skull moss had nearly vanished from respectable apothecaries. The term Usnea cranii homini disappeared from formularies. No more recipes. No more case studies. Doctors who once defended it now denied they ever believed. I never prescribed such superstition, wrote Dr. Benedict Rowe in 1841. Publicly, anyway. Privately, he still kept a jar. For historical reasons, he claimed. But it was sealed, labeled in Latin, hidden in a drawer. Old habits die hard, especially the strange ones. What remained? The moss itself, of course, kept growing, undisturbed by human opinion. Graveyards still sprouted green. Skulls still hosted life long after breath had left. In folklore, it never really left. In rural Poland, it was still called zieleni trupa corpses green and used by village healers for bleeding wounds until World War I. In Sicily, old women whispered of moss of the judged, best harvested during thunder. In parts of Romania, it was said to ward off evil dreams if kept under the pillow. And in one French village, a jar was found as late as 1902, carefully sealed, wrapped in linen, and labeled simply, "Pour les convulsions." De Jacques. Who was Jacques? No one knows. But someone believed in him. Deeply. Test tube the modern glance. Occasionally, the scientific world peeks back at these oddities with gloves and skepticism. Botanists have studied Usnea, the genus that includes skull moss, and found mild antimicrobial properties. Was it a disinfectant? Perhaps. A placebo with panache? Certainly. Medical historians now classify it under corpse pharmacology, a grim but fascinating branch that includes mummy powder, bone ash, and human fat. In fact, a 2021 thesis from the University of Edinburgh includes an entire chapter titled Green on Bone, the Cultural Mycology of Postmortem Medicinals. It concludes with this line, "Skull moss was never just moss. It was grief, desperation, and story pressed into powder, swallowed with hope. Bed and now, sleep. So what do we make of it, this soft green ghost from medicine's past? Was it superstition? Yes. Was it disgusting? Absolutely. But was it human? Deeply. Because in the end, every strange cure is born not from madness, but from love. From the need to do something when nothing works. From the belief that healing might be hiding in the dark, growing quietly on the skull of a stranger. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine a mossy graveyard. Still, damp, forgotten. A skull rests beneath a tree, cradled in roots speckled in green. It is not cursed. It is not sacred. It is simply waiting. And somewhere, in the softest breeze, you think you hear it say, "Sleep well. I am here. I've always been here." Before we invented pharmacies, we used the human body as one. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Every part of the body, living or dead, was once considered medicinal. Hair, blood, sweat, fat, teeth, bones, bile, and yes, even the moss that crept across the skull. Nothing was off limits. Nothing was too sacred or too disgusting. Because once someone died, especially if violently, they became more than a corpse. They became inventory. The philosophy was called corpus medicinae, the body as medicine. Rooted in ancient Rome and revived by Renaissance thinkers, it held that the human body, being the seat of the soul, could pass healing properties into the flesh. And if that soul departed in violence or passion, those properties became even stronger. This wasn't fringe science. It was taught, practiced, sold in open markets. Bone a catalog of cures. By the early 1600s, an ambitious apothecary might stock the following. Human fat adepts hominis, rendered from executed criminals. Used in salves for arthritis, tumors, and back pain. Mummy powder, pulvis mumii, ground from embalmed corpses stolen from Egyptian tombs or faked locally. Added to wine or spread on wounds. Blood of the young collected at executions, still warm. Drunk immediately to treat life weakness. Tooth powder, ground from animal or sometimes human teeth. Brushed on gums to strengthen the jaw. Bone ash, burned bones of the executed, crushed to fine powder. Mixed into ointments for swelling. Skull moss, muscus cranii, you know this one by now. These were not dark secrets. They were menu items. There are even surviving apothecary price lists written in beautiful calligraphy where moss from skull appears between dried viper and crushed emerald. Some shops had jars with faces carved on them, angry, sad, or laughing, depending on the effect the remedy was supposed to have. The jar for moss was usually painted green. Person standing, whose body was it, anyway? There was a hierarchy, of course. Not just any dead person would do. Criminals were best, especially if they died in agony. Virgins were prized for purity. Women were believed to offer better fat for selves. Men provided stronger bone ash. Children were rarely used officially but whispered about. This macabre sorting reflected not just superstition but a twisted kind of medical logic. The body, they believed, stored energy, emotional, spiritual, moral, and that energy could be transferred. If you were cured by the moss from a murderer's skull, perhaps his violence passed into you. Was that a risk? Or a bonus? Test tube ethics in the dark. Did people protest? Sometimes. There were religious objections. Some theologians called corpse medicine an offense to the image of God. Others insisted it desecrated the sacred mystery of death. But many physicians replied, God made man. God also made his body useful. Besides, it worked. Or so it seemed. In a world without antibiotics, anesthesia, or consistent diagnosis, results were everything. If drinking mossy wine calmed your child's seizures, who cared where it came from? Desperation is stronger than disgust. And let's not pretend the patients always knew. Many apothecaries labeled jars in Latin or code. Some disguised ingredients with sweeteners or perfume. You might have been sipping a man's scalp and never known. But the collectors knew. The grinders knew. The mixers knew. And some of them, especially those who gathered moss, began to wonder. If the body is medicine, what does that make me? Herb, the identity of the ingredient. This leads us to one of the strangest developments. Personalized corpse medicine. In a few rare cases, wealthy clients began requesting cures from specific people. A widow asked for moss only from her executed husband's skull so his death may undo my pain. A duke paid to keep the skull of his favorite hunting servant, promising to harvest the moss himself. One physician wrote of a noblewoman who asked for moss only from a red-haired woman hung at dawn. This was not medicine. It was something else. Control? Ritual? Madness? Maybe all three. But it makes sense in its own way. When you're told the cure grows on the head of the dead, wouldn't you want to know whose head? Wouldn't you want that story to mean something? So as you settle deeper into sleep, think of the old cabinets of curiosity, where the line between body and remedy blurred, where flesh became formula, where death became dosage, and where a soft green patch of moss, growing quietly on the skull of a man forgotten by history, became medicine. Not everyone could wait for a hanging. As demand for skull moss grew and official executions became less frequent, some people, particularly healers and rural apothecaries, began to ask a dangerous question. What if we could grow it ourselves? The idea seemed simple. If moss grew on a skull in a graveyard, why not bring the graveyard home? All you needed was the right conditions. A human skull, damp air, shade, time, and, if you believed the old instructions, perhaps a little suffering still clinging to the bone. It sounds absurd. It was absurd. But people tried. And in dark cellars, locked pantries, and overgrown root cellars, tiny, secret gardens began to sprout. In Bohemia, a healer named Leda was known for her epilepsy tinctures. She claimed her moss was fresher than the apothecaries. Her secret? A skull in a clay pot, kept moist with well water and covered in linen. She sang to it every morning. Her neighbors reported strange humming beneath the floorboards. One day, her house burned down. No one found a body. But in the ashes, they discovered a single blackened skull with moss still clinging to it, untouched by the flames. In France, a disgraced doctor named Lambert wrote an unpublished manuscript detailing his experiments with moss cultivation. He tried different skulls, old, young, male, female. He varied the humidity, the light, the soil. He even played music, lute, flute, and once a children's choir. The moss grew faster on skulls of those who died young. Like they still had energy left to give, he noted. He also claimed the moss smelled different depending on the emotions of the person before death. Grief left a sweeter scent. Rage made it sharp and acrid. Suicide he would not describe. His manuscript ended with one line, written shakily. The moss is remembering me now. Lambert was never seen again. Others weren't so poetic. In rural Germany, poor families sometimes passed down skulls as heirlooms, not of loved ones, but of helpful dead. They were kept in boxes, watered during Lent, and dusted weekly. The moss was shaved and mixed into holiday wine for health and long life. One traveler described it as the most festive horror I ever drank. He also admitted it cured his gout. And then there were the fakes. Animal skulls sold as human. Green lichen passed off as authentic moss. Even dyed fabric glued to bone. Some shops grew moss on cow skulls in underground gardens and sold it to city apothecaries. Judgment-free moss, they called it. No execution, no crime, just moss. Did it work? Who knows? But people felt better buying it, because even among those who believed in the cure, there was always a quiet discomfort. Was this helping me or haunting me? Still, some took it further. We have letters from an estate near Milan where a nobleman built what he called La Serra del Assa, the bone greenhouse. Inside, he arranged over 24 skulls on pedestals, each labeled with the cause of death. He kept records, watered carefully, even employed a gardener. Visitors paid to tour it. Poets wrote sonnets about it. One bishop declared it an offense to God and gardening both. But no one could deny the moss grew thickest there. Deep green, velvet-like, almost glowing in the dark. What was it people were chasing? A real cure? A ritual? A sense of control over death? Maybe all of it. But more than anything, it was about certainty. If the world is chaotic and illness strikes without warning, then a skull in a pot at least gives you something to do. Something to tend. Something to hope from. Even if it's a lie. Even if it's just green fuzz on old bone. So tonight, as your breathing slows and your thoughts drift like mist through old cellars, imagine them, the forbidden gardens. Stone shelves lined with grinning skulls. Tiny tufts of moss like sleepy eyebrows. The soft sound of water dripping in the dark. A quiet voice whispering, grow, grow, grow. And in the stillness, the feeling that something is alive down there. Not evil, not holy, just watching, waiting to be useful. Let us pause for a moment. We've wandered through apothecaries and graveyards, watched hands reach through fog to scrape bone, seen moss gathered with reverence, and sometimes with greed. But a question still hangs in the air, soft as spores. Why moss? Of all the things that could grow from a dead man's skull, why did people believe this tiny, fuzzy plant held the power to stop seizures, close wounds, and chase death from the body? What was it about moss that made it seem like medicine? Part of it surely was the setting. Imagine a skull left in the forest, or high on a gallows, or behind an apothecary's house, slowly fading into the earth. Nothing else survives. Not the eyes, not the flesh, only the bone. And then, over time, something green, soft, unexpected. It feels like nature saying, I'm not done with this yet. Moss grows where nothing else can. On stone, on old wood, on brick, on bone. It needs little sun, little soil, thrives in silence and shade. To the people of early modern Europe, this was no coincidence. Moss, they believed, was a mediator between death and life. It rose from decay but carried renewal. It clung to corpses but never smelled like rot. It was life that needed death to grow, and so they trusted it. But there were deeper ideas at play, stranger ones. Some thinkers, particularly among the Paracelsians, followers of the radical physician Paracelsus, believed that moss was the purest form of vegetal sympathy. They argued, the moss does not just grow on the skull, it feeds on its final energy. It absorbs the memory of the life once housed in that head. A poet of the time wrote, what blood remains, it drinks. What thoughts remain, it keeps. A silent green tongue that speaks in seizure sleep. This wasn't science. It wasn't religion. It was a new kind of logic, part spiritual, part botanical. There was also the shape. Moss grows low, close to the surface, covers without smothering. It heals without cutting. It asks nothing. Unlike roots, it doesn't burrow. Unlike vines, it doesn't strangle. It simply appears. To many, that humility made it purer. The belief was that moss grew not from greed, but from patience. Not from ambition, but from stillness. And so it must be good. Physicians had other explanations. Some said the moss acted like a sponge, drying excess humors in the brain. Others believed it absorbed bad vapors from the skull, cleaning the space around it. In Italy, one herbal manual claimed, "Where moss grows, poison flees." In Scotland, it was known as death's wool, and said to pull illness from the blood. And in rural parts of Eastern Europe, the moss wasn't harvested at all. It was left on the skull, and the patient was brought to breathe near it. Yes, people were led into crypts, made to kneel beside skulls, and inhale. One record from Poland reads, "She was made to sit before the old head with its green hat. The fits did not return. No one thought to ask what else she might have breathed in." And then, of course, there was color. Green. Green has always been the color of life, of healing, of spring after a long winter. To people in the past, green was not just pleasant, it was restorative. They believed looking at green things soothed the soul. Even today, we use that idea in hospital gowns, in waiting rooms, in the glow of nature documentaries before bed. So when moss appeared on something as horrible as a skull, green was mercy, a softening, a bandage for the mind. All of this, the color, the setting, the stillness, made moss seem like a bridge between death and recovery, between violence and calm, between the horror of what had happened and the hope that something good might still grow from it. People needed to believe in something like that. They still do. So tonight, as you rest and let your mind soften like old stone, think of moss not as a weed or a parasite or even a cure, but as a message, a whisper from the quiet places, a gentle hand on the forehead, a reminder that even in the worst of endings, something green still grows. Let's turn the page once more slowly. Now the candle is dimmer. The night has deepened. The story draws closer to its soft, strange heart. This is not a record from a ledger, not a footnote in a dusty herbal. This is the kind of story passed down in whispers, not because it was secret, but because it was fragile. They called him Elias. No last name, no title, just Elias, a boy with fits. He lived at the edge of a forest in a cottage with a wide chimney and a mother who sang when she worked. The fits came young. They started as flutters in the hand, then a twitch in the eye, then one night, the full storm. His body stiffened, his jaw locked, and his heels beat the floor like a warning. They called the healer. They lit candles. They prayed. Nothing stopped it. But Elias was kind, and strange, and full of wonder. He spoke to trees. He arranged moss and leaves on stones in quiet patterns. He once told a priest, "I think God watches from underneath." His mother tried everything. Rosemary, vinegar, cold baths, fasting, hot stones on the spine. And still the fits returned. Soft as fog, sudden as fire. One day a traveler came through, a woman with a satchel of vials and a voice like carved wood. She sold powders, oils, things in jars. And stories. She spoke of cities where moss from a criminal's skull could stop the shaking of even the wildest minds. She said it worked when all else failed. She said she had one dose left. His mother bought it, with her ring, her winter stores, her last coin. She was told to mix it with warmed wine, to give it to Elias at moonrise, and to whisper something the moss would remember. She chose his name. Elias drank it, coughed, laughed, said it tasted like stone and tears. That night he did not seize, nor the next. A week passed, a month. His hands were still, his eyes clear. He went walking, farther each day. He smiled again, but then he began to dream. He spoke of voices under the earth, of faces with no eyes, of a garden made only of heads all turned toward him. He said the moss was lonely, that it missed the skull it came from. His mother wept, not from fear, but from knowing she had taken something sacred and fed it to someone she loved. One evening, Elias returned from the woods carrying a stone, flat, pale, and damp. He said, "I think the moss wants to come back." That night, he slept beside it. By morning, his bed was empty, the door ajar, and the stone green. Not wildly, not impossibly, just a small patch, soft, new, and undeniable. They searched for weeks. No trace, no footprints. Only the stone remained. And each day the moss grew. His mother left the cottage, but she returned every year on the date of the first fit. Each time, the stone was greener. Eventually, it was covered entirely. They say she whispered to it, thanked it, forgave it. Then one year, she didn't come. No one does now. But the stone still waits, covered in moss that never spreads to the forest floor. Only there. Only where he laid it. Maybe it's just a story. Maybe it was never real. But if you visit that stretch of forest near the edge where the trees grow old and wide, you may find a stone that hums in silence. You may see something green that you've come a long way. Through fog and cellars, through bones and stories, through powders taken in fear and moss harvested in moonlight. Now the candles are low. The apothecary is closed. And the moss for tonight has finished speaking. But before we leave, there's one more thing to consider. Something simple. Something small. Not history. Not medicine. Just what it means to believe in something quiet. The world has never stopped trying to heal itself. And when we, with our breakable bodies and exhausted minds, look for help, we reach in every direction. Sometimes we reach upward. Sometimes outward. But sometimes we look down. At the earth. At the stone. At the moss. Not because it's powerful. Not because it's proven. But because it keeps growing, even in the places no one else wants to touch. And maybe that's all some people needed. Not a cure. Not a miracle. Just the sight of something soft and green, rising from the hardest place. We try to make sense of pain. We label it. Study it. Run from it. But in other times, in quieter ones, people sat with it. They lit a candle. Whispered a name. Crushed moss into powder, not knowing if it would help, only hoping it wouldn't hurt. They believed in the echo of life, even when it grew from a skull. You may never see moss the same way again. You may pause when you notice it on an old wall or creeping up a forgotten tree. You may find yourself staring, just for a moment, wondering what story it carries, what it remembers, what it healed, and who once whispered to it. So now, as your breath softens and the quiet deepens, leave behind the gallows, the cellars, the jars. Let them fade. Let the skull rest. Let the moss grow, because not every strange thing needs an answer. Not every cure needs a chart. And not every night needs silence. Some need a story. Tonight, that story is ending. But the moss will keep growing, even in dreams,